Well, what do you think, Professor Khalid, about what's going on in Syria? Maybe post Assad collapse. How do you see um, the kind of partnership between the HTS and USA and Israel and Turkey, and what are their aims, and how likely are they to be successful in using what they themselves, even in the United Nations, it was marked as like a terrorist organization, and now they're giving it kind of legitimacy. How likely is that to actually succeed?
Yeah, I don't think they've actually removed the terrorist designation,
Not
have
yet,
they?
no.
Well, we'll see. That's problematic too. And maybe
Because
they will.
I think it's not recognized as terrorist just by USA, which would have been easy to remove, but by the United Nations. So it's going to be a little bit more tricky for them to remove that label.
Yes. First of all, there are all kinds of different influences and forces here, and they are far from united. Even though they may have temporary alliances, and even though they may have the kindness of not denouncing each other publicly because they are hoping for some kind of cooperation or some kind of outcome favorable to their side. The collapse of the Assad regime was quite astonishing in its swiftness, that is true, although it's not unexampled. The collapse of South Vietnam in 1975 and of the American-sponsored Lon Nol regime in Cambodia in the same year, the collapse of the American-sponsored regime in Kabul in the
Yes.
wake of the Taliban, who actually had the impudence to take over the whole country before the Americans had even quite left it, because the American troops were still there, and the Taliban kindly, did not attack them and said, "Okay, you're going, so bye bye. We're peaceful with you now. The war is over." And so on. So a kind of another example, and the one that's most parallel, because those other examples, there was American intervention, military intervention, but an example that there was not, that's very parallel, is the collapse of Ethiopia, the Mengistu regime in 1991. If you think about the collapse of the Mengistu regime and the collapse of the Assad regime, these are very parallel. And the Mengistu regime was, fighting the Eritreans, and the Eritreans were like 5% of the population of the country, and the Ethiopians were 95% of the population of Ethiopia. And yet the Eritreans conquered Ethiopia. They actually conquered the capital city of Ethiopia. And this was, I have said, a cat eaten by a mouse.
Wow.
And it was a shocking downfall. And Mengistu fled and abandoned all of his government and so on to whatever would happen to it, very similar to how Assad fled. So there was a lot of similarity in those two collapses. Now, the interests of the states around them, although Israel and the United States were rejoicing over this and so on, it's still sort of like the Israeli settlers anticipating Trump will give them a blank check. It's kind of whistling in the dark because they don't know. And the basic fact of the matter is it's impossible for the regime of Julani, who is Ahmed al-Shara, the new ruler of Syria, apparently, of the main part of Syria. It's completely impossible for him to reconcile with Israel. There are so many obstacles to that. Israel is not sponsoring him, did not sponsor him, and did not give him and his group any actual direct support. Israel is delighted, maliciously delighted, with the collapse of Assad regime, but it also has a reservation about it in that it wants the fighting among the Syrians to go on, and it does not want any regime to take over all of Syria. And Israel also has been always cultivating the sympathy of the Kurds. And of course, the likelihood of a clash between the new regime and the Kurds is considerable. And especially that the new regime is often seen as sponsored by Turkey in particular. And of course, the Turkish government, Erdogan, has a kind of so-called Islamic approach. And the Turkish Islam, however, interestingly, is more than any other country in the Muslim world extremely suffused with nationalism. So that Turkey doesn't really have any of the groups that are transnational that exist in other Muslim states, such as Salafiyya, such as Ikhwan, or something like that. It may have the government there may have an alliance with Ikhwan, foreign Ikhwan, but it doesn't have any Turkish Ikhwan. And all the Turkish religious movements internally, such as the Fethullah Gulen movement, the Hizmet, and so on, are also suffused with Turkish nationalism. They only exist basically among Turks who are Turkish, and it's something that's very separatist off like that. So it's kind of an alliance of convenience then with these people in Syria, the HTS or Hizb Tahrir al-Sham. It's their alliance of convenience. And even before this, of course, there's a different alliance or a group of people sponsored by the Turks in the Turkish occupied zone, like around Manbij and that area. And then that's opposed to the HTS. But there was a sort of temporary alliance between them. The HTS was able to overrun the four big cities of Syria, Aleppo, Hama, Hems, and Damascus, the capital city. And then Israel even had the gall to take over the lower slopes of Mount Hermon, to occupy the demilitarized zone, and in other words, move into territory that had been Syrian in complete violation of the ceasefire agreement, which Syria had always upheld. And Israel explained that that was with the Ba'ath regime only, and now the Ba'ath regime was gone, so that didn't apply anymore, which is also false. And so the possibility of cooperation with Israel is nil. And that's because Israel simply won't cooperate with such a regime, not because the regime itself will not cooperate with Israel. Now, there are many reasons why Ahmed al-Shara and the Salafiyya tending group that he belongs to could not also make peace with Israel. For one thing, he is maybe not born in, but from a family from one of the villages in the Golan Heights that was destroyed by Israel in 1967. And it's absolutely impossible that those interior Syrian refugees from the Golan Heights, who were in 1967 110,000 people, and by now have probably multiplied up to 500,000, it's completely impossible that they can say, oh yes, it was just and good that Israel occupied and annexed the Golan Heights. They can't say that. And so therefore there is no basis whatsoever for Syria joining a peace treaty with Israel unless Israel gives back the Golan Heights. And Israel is not in a mood to do so at the moment. In the long run, maybe something can be worked out, but that's not the tendency of the hour at all.
Hey there. I hope you're enjoying this episode. Let me just take a moment to introduce our sponsors for today. This episode is kindly being sponsored by the Worldwide Listings Company Limited, or WLC for short. WLC is a complete A to Z Amazon account management service. So if you're looking to start an e-commerce business, or you already have a business that you want to take to the next level, then get in touch and WLC will be able to help. Just for transparency purposes, let me also mention that WLC is a company that I personally created and am a director of. So when you get in touch with WLC, you will be speaking with directly myself or my team, and we very much look forward to speaking with you to see how we can serve your needs. Thank you. And with that said, let's get back to the episode.
Israel and the US are principally delighted because they feel that the Salafiyya, who have taken over the Syrian main cities and replaced the Ba'athist government, and thereby reunited Idlib and that enclave with the rest of the country. They feel that they being Salafiyya, are ideologically so hostile to Shia and Iran, and especially Hezbollah, who helped the Ba'ath regime considerably as their enemies, that they will cut off Hezbollah and make Hezbollah all the more isolated from supplies and be able to, excuse me, to really get Hezbollah now because of that. I would say about that, maybe, maybe not. We'll just have to see how things work out. First of all, the Houthis in Yemen are completely isolated geographically, surrounded by enemies on all sides, and they do not have any conduit of supplies because they cannot bring in supplies by sea either. And nevertheless, there they are, thumbing their noses at the world empire and fighting it, and shooting off missiles at international commerce in the Bab el Mandeb Strait and the Red Sea and so on, and shooting at the American Navy to boot, and also shooting at Israel from a long distance, and very intermittently, and not doing much damage, of course, but still, this is something very intolerable to Israel. And because they're so isolated, I would think Hezbollah being isolated, it doesn't matter. I would think that they would still be in the same position, and that the rejoicing of the Israelis over this is premature. I think that a struggle between the HTS and the Kurds is likely. And the HTS is not inclined to allow an autonomous Kurdistan inside of Syria. The Kurds, for their part, have not tried to declare an independent state because they know that that would make things worse for them. Similar to in Iraq, when the Iraqi Kurdistan regional government passed a resolution favoring independence or something, and then immediately the Shi'i-dominated government of Iraq attacked them and took Kirkuk away from them. And they lost a huge amount of territory as a result of that, foolish gesture to say, oh, well, we should be independent. Now, like other nationalisms, the ultimate goal of the Kurds would be to have a great, huge national Kurdish state in all the Kurdish majority areas, which are considerable territory, from Syria, Iraq, Turkey, and Iran. But at the present time, that's just not envisionable. And so the Kurds, in their part, are saying, well, we want to have an autonomous region. And the Ba'ath government left that open for negotiation. So the Ba'ath government had a peaceful arrangement with the Kurds, where the capital cities of Hasaka and Qamishli, of two of the provinces in northeast Syria, remained under Ba'ath control, with the Syrian military there in those cities, surrounded by Kurdish-controlled territory, completely cut off. And that was just fine. Kurds and the Ba'ath got along, and they had a peaceful agreement over that, because both of them had other enemies to contend with, the Kurds to contend with Turkey, and the Ba'ath to contend with other movements besides the Kurds. So the Kurds kind of got away with that, and the Kurds had greatly expanded their territory by driving out maybe at least 200,000 Sunni Arabic-speaking villagers from the Jazeera, from areas that they took over, and so forth. Even though they were at the same time trying to promote the idea, oh, we're not driving anybody out. Well, and Ahmed Shara is saying the same thing. We're not persecuting any minorities. We're not driving anybody out. But in effect, that happened in that region. So some conflict, perhaps, between the new regime and the Kurds is likely to take place. The conflict that is happening right now is between a Turkish-sponsored group and the Turkish military against the Kurds along the Euphrates River. So that is a currently hot conflict that's going on right there. The other thing is that, is it possible for this small HTS group to take over the whole apparatus of the Syrian state and just have all of that work instantly? Not likely. It's more likely that this is a process that will take quite some time for them to get established. And that, of course, pleases the United States and Israel, because the Syrian state will be weak during this time. And the West will not remove sanctions. There's a tendency in the United States to not remove sanctions from any place that has sanctions on it.
Right.
They just won't remove sanctions against any place that has sanctions on it, because if they do that, they see that as a disadvantage to themselves. So they just want to continue sanctions regime, I think that will be difficult to remove. I mean, maybe someday it could be removed, especially if um, wealthy oil state sponsors of the HTS, such as the Emirates and perhaps Saudi Arabia, were to intervene in their favor. That might have some effect, possibly, but I don't know. And then the HTS has to be weak itself in regard to the rest of the Syrian population, which probably, in general, do not really support them. That is, they might, let's imagine what percent of support they might have. They might have 25% support. If they have that much, that's normally what the support is for a government in, a country. It's 25%. And usually that's enough to leverage power because most of the rest of the people are indifferent rather than opposed. It would be like in Egypt when the Egyptian revolution happened and the Muslim Brotherhood regime and then the military coup against Morsi and all of that. It was difficult to tell, but I would estimate that the Egyptian military regime has 25% support. And I estimate the Muslim Brotherhood had like 25% support. And I estimate 50% of the people were indifferent. And so 25% support in a situation like that is practically enough. It's enough to rule. But you might not get a lot of cooperation. There might be opposition. So what is the Alawite region going to do? There's this region of the Alawites along the coast and the mountains, the interior of the coast between Turkey and Lebanon. The Alawites constitute not less than 11% of the population of Syria. This is a major population then of several million people. And they can't just be massacred or driven out. That's not going to happen. So what exactly would happen there is very difficult to say. And of course, if you look in detail at the Alawite region, some of the least damaged cities in Syria were Laviqiyah or Latakia and Tartus, where the Russians had their naval base. These cities were not damaged in the war, and they are predominantly Sunni in population, but the hinterland is all Alawite. So how is that going to go down? And as usual, the big losers are likely to be the Christians, because the Christians don't have really any territory of their own. They're scattered in all of these towns, and just like in Iraq, the Iraqi Christians were just wiped out. It was a terrible disaster. The American invasion of Iraq led to the total wipeout of the Iraqi Christian community. I would estimate in Iraq that 80% of the Christians have left the country at least. And most of the rest, many of them are in Iraqi Kurdistan, where they found what I would call a reluctant welcome. And some of the towns that they've been able to repopulate in the area where Christian population was concentrated in the north, but they couldn't have any autonomous zone of themselves, so everybody attacked them, and they just lost and lost and lost and lost. It's very unfortunate.